My name is Guadalupe Garcia McCall. I'm from the San Antonio area. I'm a teacher there. I'm also an author, the author of Under the Mesquite, Summer of the Mariposas, and Shame the Stars.
Got it. All right, come forward. Okay.
All right, so I'll start off with the first question. So you said that in your author's notes that you said that Joaquin spoke to you, and that's how you were able to develop his character. So how did the others I can't talk today. How did the other characters come to you?
I think they all came through Joaquin. He introduced me to them. He first told me about his girlfriend. That was like the main thing that he was all focused on. So he told me about Dulceña and the conflict there and why he couldn't see her and how much he loved her and hoped to marry her someday. And then he started talking to me about the Rangers. It seemed to be a big concern for him. But what was even more of a concern for him was the conflict of his father. That the father is so very close to the Rangers and how he feels like there's something wrong with that, especially because of everything that Dulceña is informing him. So he's hearing good things about the Rangers from his father, and he's hearing bad things about the Rangers from his father. He doesn't necessarily know what his brother is, what side he's on, but he knows that his brother is a priest. So he introduced me to all the characters a little bit at a time.
Oh, and by the way, I'm Rosalie. I probably should have started with that. I'm Rosalie. This is Asia. That's Mr. Scott. That's Angie. This is Maricruz, and that's Mike. So
Nice to meet y'all.
All right. Should I go with my next question? All right. So for my next question, how did you know who you were going to sacrifice when you realized you were writing a tragedy?
I thought I was sacrificing somebody else. In fact, in the first rendition, in the first rough draft, somebody else died. His father died. And he died in a totally different way. His father had gone rogue and had been, he was out there fighting with the revolutionaries. He was part of the cause. And that's how he met his death. And it was a very tragic death, and it was very Shakespearean. But in revising the manuscript and because I turned it from verse, it was a verse novel, and I turned it into prose. And when I did that revision, I did a lot of research. And one of the things that happened is another character died. The mother died. And then my editor and I talked about it, and we said, let's just have one death. Pobrecito Joaquin, you don't want to take everything away from him. So let's have one death, and let's choose the more tragic one, who is more important to him at that time, and it was his mother. And it almost felt like, not that I wanted to kill her off, it was the biggest tragedy of them all, I think, in the book.
So in the book, you said, so in the back where you wrote your author's notes, you said your son came in and he showed you this the whole thing on the Texas Rangers and what he learned in school, and it haunted you, and you saw this photo. Why didn't you include that photo in the author's notes?
I didn't know what to do about that. I didn't necessarily want the photo. I think I wanted more the word. The word is such an important part of the book. To understand that your words are important, that your voice is important. So the photograph to me was haunting, yes, but the fact that we haven't used our words to stop that from happening again, we haven't learned how to own our words. That was more important. So I wanted to include the clippings from the newspapers because those are the word of the time. And those words were speaking to me far more than the photograph itself.
Okay. So you identify as Tejano, right?
Yes.
Yes. So do you believe Tejanos in Texas were subjected to a more severe racism than Chicanos in Arizona and California?
I don't know that it was more as it was different. Of course, it has to feel personal for me because I live there. But I also did not experience that. When I was growing up, I'm from Mexico. I came in when I was 6 years old. So I do identify myself as a Tejana, and I identify as a Mexican American. But I did not know that history. I did not know that history because all I had ever heard was the stories of the revolution from the Mexican side, because that's what my father knew. So those were the stories I had come to know. But I don't think that we can say that one is more than another. I think we can just say they're different, as different as one apple to another apple to another apple. It's they are not significant, they're just different.
So it's kind of funny. So I think that it's clear that ignorance is a problem, and we just don't know a lot of this information, and a lot of times there's a disconnect, and it doesn't really feel personal. But do you think there's a right way about including this history in our curriculum?
I think there's definitely responsibility that needs to be taken into account when we are including it in the curriculum. I know that as a teacher, I always think first critically about how I'm going to introduce a topic to my classroom, to my students. And so that's the same way I approached the book. I was very careful to, one, have the right research done and make sure that I knew exactly what I was talking about. And two, also responsible as to who my readers were. And I knew I wanted my students to read it. And I knew I wanted other students in high schools to read it, but I also wanted adults to read it. And so there was that fine line. I feel like I'm walking on the edge, like Federico Lorca said. You know, you walk on the edge of a cliff with your duende, and you decide whether you're going to jump in and how soon you're going to jump. And I was on that edge, and I feel like the book is edgy like that. But I wanted it to be like that because I wanted it to interest the readers, and not just young adults, but also adults. And I wanted to inform them in a responsible way.
On page 82, we see a perfect example of victim shaming of Dulcinea by Monroe. Do you see victim shaming as a problem in schools, and in what ways?
I think we do it not just in schools. I think we do it everywhere. I think we do it at home. I think we do it in the streets. I think we do it in the hallways. I think we need to be very mindful of that. But as adults, we need to be very careful when we do things like that because we don't want to subjugate. And I think that's what happens at the end. People feel like they can't speak out. They can't stand up. And the whole point of the book, like Joaquin says in one of his final poems, is stand up and speak up. So when you see it happen, you want to say, that's not right, and step up. Be brave.
So what inspired you to base this book on the classic of Romeo and Juliet?
Well, when the first poem came, and it was Joaquin telling me about Rancho Las Moras, the first thing he said to me, and I was asleep, and I woke up and he said, my name is Joaquin del Toro. I live in Rancho Las Moras, and I want to tell you my story. And I thought, okay, back to sleep. He said it 5 times before I woke up, and I went to the the bathroom. I was in the bathroom. I put the seat down, and I'm in my jammies, and I got a pen and pencil and paper, and I'm just writing and writing and writing. And one of the things he did was tell me about Dulcinea. And the more I wrote like 20 pages that night of poetry. I did not go to sleep. I actually, from there, went into going to work, getting dressed and going to work. But I kept thinking the whole time he's telling me about Dulcinea, I'm thinking, this is like Romeo and Juliet. You know, this is so Romeo and Juliet. And maybe because my son was also dating at that time, and the girl that he was dating was such an important person in his life. I think and he was the one that introduced this topic to me. I think I was blending everything in my head, you know, and I wanted to bring that out. I wanted to bring out that romance in there because I think a lot of times we think of revolution and we think of war and we think big picture and we think group against group, but we don't think about love and family and what is war really when you boil down to the very, very, very center of it. Who is really in the conflict? Family and love. That's what's really at loss. So I wanted to bring that out.
And it is usually men who write westerns and war novels. Did you think about that? In what ways did that intimidate you or motivate you?
I kept asking myself if I was the right person for this story. I just kept thinking, I've never written a boy before. I've always written girls, even in things that have not been published yet. I've always written in the girl voice, in the female voice. So that was my biggest concern first. Am I getting it right? And then second, I kept thinking, I'm writing a Western. I'm writing something that is from a time period I don't understand. I've never been there, but it was a challenge, and it was a challenge that felt fresh and it felt new to me, and I'm up for a challenge always.
Well, I was taking down notes. When I was reading the book, like I view everything like a movie. You know what I mean? So I'm playing it all back in my head, and like I keep seeing this little scene. We have this little place called Old Tucson, and I just kept thinking about that, and then I started wondering like, have you considered maybe taking it to like a different platform, the way like Zoot Suit is kind of like on Broadway, or maybe like a play, or maybe even a movie? Like, have you thought about that?
Nothing would please me more. Nothing would please me more. I took a class this summer. I'm in an MFA program at UTEP online, and I took a class on screenwriting. It was my very first attempt at screenwriting, and they said I had to come up with a story. And so I happened to be writing the sequel to Shame the Stars at the time, and I had half of the novel written, but I had to stop everything to write this screenplay. So I thought, no te quiebres la cabeza. Don't go crazy here. Why work twice as hard? Work smart, right? So what I did is I took the new novel, the sequel, and I turned that into a screenplay for class.
Nice.
And my professor loved it. So I was like, and he kept saying, you really know, you could do this. You could make this into a movie. And I kept thinking, after the book comes out. So nothing would please me more than to write a script and to bring this story and its sequel into a film. That would be an amazing thing to do, I think.
Awesome.
So anybody out there who wants to buy that, I'm here. Talk to me.
That's all I kept seeing was like a very poetic film. Like I could just see it all coming together. That's why I had to ask that. And also like, you know, the whole Romeo and Juliet aura is sometimes, you know, usually sometimes even overlooked because it might seem like cliche or even a little corny, but like it doesn't feel like that. It feels way more authentic. It feels a lot heavier. And I just wanted to ask, like, how do you find blending, you know, a concept that's like so tainted by Shakespeare with, you know, the Mexican Revolution? Like it's just, it all flows together.
I wanted it to have the hints of it. I did not want it to be a retelling as much as a reimagining. I kept thinking about that word. It's reimagined because we all know people who have fallen in love with the wrong person or somebody who their family say, you cannot see that person. Romeo and Juliet is in our lives, in our everyday lives. And it's in our classrooms, it's in our hallways, it's in our kitchen, it's everywhere. And so I wanted it to be a reimagining. So what I did when my editor and I decided that we were going to go ahead and go that way, that it was going to be a reimagining, she said, start thinking of how are you going to put it together? How are you going to blend that? And I wanted it to come as naturally as possible, as organically as possible. So I took one more look at Romeo and Juliet, and I thought 5 organic scenes that were iconic scenes from the original, and I thought, how can I make that ball, that masked ball, what would that look like in 1915 Mexican-American Valley area? Well, it's a quinceañera. And everybody's wearing masks, you know? It's a quinceañera. It's the same thing. You know, we dress up, and we go to a dance, and we have fun. And so I thought, I did not want anybody to die. I knew they were not going to die. They're too strong to die. The thing is too strong, and so is Joaquin. I knew neither one of them would do something like that. But I did want to have a death. And I did want it to be a tragedy, a Shakespearean kind of tragedy, something that is overwhelmingly sad. And so that's why I went ahead and did that. But there were other scenes. The balcony scene is in there. The death of Mercutio was in there. So there's all that. And then I don't know if you even noticed it or you came upon it, but there's 12 literary eggs in there. There are 12 little tiny pieces of the actual Romeo and Juliet that you would be able to find them and say, oh, that's from Act 1, Scene 4 or something. So there's 12 of those in there. Shame the Stars is a literary egg, the title. The brightness of her cheeks were shame those stars.
I have one more question.
Sure.
For La Estrella, is she based off a real person either in your life or in history that maybe a strong woman role model was there?
I see La Estrella as every woman that I knew and every woman that I have not known that was a strong woman. I saw pictures of las soldaderas online, and I saw them with their, jackets with the bullets and the rifles, and they're standing tall and their shoulders back and their chest pushed out, and I thought, yes, we are the stars. We are the ancestors come back to life. And I wanted Estrella to be the epitome of every strong woman that is out there, that is fighting for her family and those who she loves. But the character of Jovita, the name Jovita comes from a real life character real life person who was a journalist of that time. And her name, she called herself Ave Negra. And so that name is based on that. And she was a journalist who actually, they burned her press down, but she continued. She persisted.
And you reference towards her in the book as well, right? Because
she calls herself
Dulceña is
Ave Negra Dos.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the second one,
Yeah.
the second coming. Hi.
I don't wonder if you come over and take this seat. Whoever's gonna ask the question, go ahead.
I'm so glad you came in. I'm so glad you made it. Oh.
Your second question.
Okay.
Not that you're hot and tired.
Poor baby.
So, I heard this was a retelling of like a Romeo and Juliet,
Mm-hmm.
and Romeo and Juliet was in the third person, so it had like kind of everyone's point of view. Why did you decide to use Joaquin to tell the story like as a first person versus the other one?
I love working with first person point of view. I think that manuscripts get closer to the reader when they're in first person. I think there is a disconnect for me as a writer when I write in third person. But also Joaquin was such a strong voice, and he spoke so passionately to me that I can't imagine writing this novel any other way other than in his voice, because he's so strong and he's so passionate and he's so important.
Okay, and then I had another question. I don't know if they asked this one already, but La Estrella, she was like this person who like kind of went and saved everyone. Did you base that off someone in like a real life story, or did you just make that up?
I kind of wanted her to be the epitome of every strong woman I know, and every strong woman that we have in Texas. We don't have enough literature with strong females that show what we're capable of.
Okay, so when you were talking about the thing with you getting into screenwriting, you said that there was going to be a sequel to this novel.
Yes.
Can you give us some insight into that? It's like maybe where the story's going, because it ended with such a cliffhanger, and I was like, I want to know what happened.
Well, I ended it that way. In fact, this is funny because one of my students was reading the book, and he comes in and he says, "Miss, I finished your book." And I said, "Cool." And he says, "Miss, not loving that ending." And then I said, "Why?" And then I think he realized that he was talking to the author and not the teacher. And he goes, "Oh, Miss, no, I really like the book." And I said, "Look, no, I said, just give it to me. Give it to me." And he says, "You left it on a cliffhanger. It's like so open." And I said, "Read the last line." And he had the book with him at his desk. And so he opens it and he reads it. And I said, "What is it saying?" And then he goes, "It's not over." And I said, "Baby, it's never going to be over until it's right, until things are done right. Until things are righted, it's not over. It wasn't over then, and in 100 years, we haven't moved more than a few inches, and we need to move on this." And so I left it that way because it's not over unless it's righted. And so we talked about that for a little bit. The sequel is 16 years later. and they are not the main characters. It's their daughter. That's all I'm going to say. 1931, 1931 repatriation.
Fair enough.
16 years later. Is it started a quinceañera?
Yeah. And it's during in 1931, I don't know if you know this, but over 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were sent back to Mexico, repatriated. Some of them, more than 600,000 of them, were American citizens who had never been to Mexico and didn't speak the language. And so to say you're going to be repatriated into a place that you've never been a patriot of, how can that happen? And so, but it did happen. And there's talk of that happening again. And so I think at this time is a relevant topic to talk about. So the manuscript is done and we're working on revisions.
That was one of the questions that I had before, with all this going on, with our presidency and all. I feel like, would you ever feel like maybe, I don't know, in 100 years there'd be a book, like a love story about what's going on now, though, you know what I mean? In 2017.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I found so many parallels to what's going on, and like I just couldn't help but wonder. Like,
I love that your mind was working like that, because that is exactly what I want young people to be doing with this book. I want them to look at this book critically. I want them to look at it as, how far have we come? Where are we now? And where do we need to go? And how do we get there? Because what we've done in the past hasn't worked. So what are we going to do to prove that we are important, to make ourselves be heard? And so I wanted the book to do that, to open up some conversations about that in classrooms, with families, in the media, wherever we need to open up those conversations. But I love that you were working that way.